in shaping fair working conditions. But in many countries, including Botswana, the process can be complicated by power dynamics, economic pressures, and political influence, particularly in the public sector. Now, as Botswana seeks to modernize its labor relations and align with global best practices, questions arise about how unions and employers can move beyond adversarial negotiations to collaborate on solutions that benefit workers, organizations, and the wider economy. Now, in studio, I'm joined by Keaoleboga, Dipogiso, labor policy expert, to discuss what makes collective bargaining effective and how can unions and employers move from the us versus them adversarial approach to working together for real solution. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, sir. I greet you and the listeners at home.
All right. Let's start a conversation by understanding the bargaining between the employer and the employee. What does it mean, and who really does it benefit?
Well, collective bargaining, maybe let's start with maybe the historic aspect of it, that the origins of work, such that in the social contract, like in the days, work wasn't collective, it was rather individual. You know, people were doing work in their own individual spaces, you know, as you could maybe see remnants of it in the hunting, gathering societies that are still there. And in those societies, there were no employers and employees. People were doing so for their own personal benefits and all of that. But with the emergence of private property ownership, there became the necessity that other people are going to work and others were going to own the means of production. And therefore, there had to be those power imbalances and power balances as to how much labor is provided and how much compensation is actually accrued towards the labor that produces in the marketplace during those days. From the feudalist era to the now or modern capitalist era, we have those dynamics of how much labor is to be procured for how much amount of work and how much compensation is to be granted. And throughout the years, we've had events that have influenced the level at which this collective bargaining, or rather the power imbalances that happen in the workplace, have been shaped and reshaped. We could talk about the Industrial Revolution itself, where people worked for extensive hours per day. They were getting paltry wages. There were no social security and all of those. But worker organizations came to mount a very fervent battle against such conditions to improve the workplace and all of that. The Haymarket crisis of 1886 is one of the examples where workers also collectively bargain for the 8-hour day that we have currently today. So collective bargaining is that aspect where collective work that is done by a group of people is actually protected by those numbers in the terms of trying to improve the conditions of service.
Right.
Yes.
In short, it benefits both the employer and the employee that we have these negotiations.
It benefits both the employer and the employees, and it ensures that there is what you call industrial peace in the workplace, so that production occurs without either parties being hampered by, a lack of productivity on the side of the employers, or rather lack of enough pay on the side of employees.
All right.
Yes.
And now you've given a full background where it came from. Now, how does collective bargaining in Botswana compare with practices in other countries around the world?
Well, collective bargaining generally across the world is two-pronged. There is collective bargaining in the private sector, and there is collective bargaining in the public sector. And those are regulated by different conventions, international conventions of the ILO, Convention 89, that talks about the right to organize and collective bargaining, and Convention 98, that talks about the freedom to organize and collective bargaining. Those are the international benchmarks that say that gives the international best practice on how national legislation has to be couched so that it protects both the employees and the workers in the workplace. In the terms of public service bargaining, there is Convention 151 of the ILO that also stipulates how collective bargaining has to happen. It excludes some levels of some pockets of employees, as, for example, those that work in the security sector are not allowed to join labor movements and all of those things. So there is not much difference in terms of how internationally collective bargaining happens compared to how it happens locally. The only thing that could be there is the level of experience that we have in our local context. Botswana still lags quite behind. We caught up very lately in terms of adopting or ratifying conventions, particularly those conventions that deal with collective bargaining. We only ratified them, I think, in 1997 or thereabout, and then we domesticated them a little later, and that is how we maybe lagged behind in terms of how we practice our collective bargaining and labor relations in the country.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We've got short time, but I've got a lot more that I wanted us to ask. So we are going to briefly answer these questions. You're talking about, you know, the public sector and the private sector and what is happening in other countries and when it began that we caught up very late. Now, we have seen this back and forth between the public sector and maybe these other organizations that the public sector are under by What are the main challenges that we find, because we're going to narrow it down to where we are right now? What are the challenges that make negotiations adversarial between unions and, you know, employers in Botswana?
Well, in terms of the public service, like you correctly pointed, there has been a lot of negative implications that we derive from the practices here, right from 2011, when we first experienced collective bargaining in the public service. Remember, for a very long time, we didn't have legislation that allowed public servants to join trade unions. And we only started having it in 2008 through the Public Service Act. And the very first litmus test was the 2011 negotiations that were marred with bad faith and all of that. And this marked an experience that I think institutionally we still are reeling from those birth pains that the employer and the employees can cozy up enough to make the negotiations productive. There is a lot of bad faith. There is a lot of positional bargaining that is happening. There is no give and take, if you like.
I would like to understand, maybe if you can explain those. When we're talking about bad faith, what is it? When we're talking about, you know, position, what is it that we are really talking about?
Bad faith bargaining involves a lot of things. If I were to give an example, during the 2011 negotiations, when the public sector unions were busy indulging in the industrial action, the then president was busy also announcing that even if they were to strike for so and so years, nothing will happen. Whereas what is required is that the bargaining itself happens within the auspice of the law, right? The structure that was established then by the Act, the PSBC, the Public Service Bargaining Council, was the one that was supposed to handle this matter exclusively, not some other political figure outside. That amounts to bad faith bargaining, yes. And positional bargaining is where, you know, there is no compromise in the terms of how you deal with your differences. The other one assumes a far right corner and the other one assumes a far left corner, and there is no one between the parties who is willing to move an inch towards the center. And therefore, the negotiations end up failing in that regard.
All right.
Yes.
I believe there are many challenges that we see here now. How can both unions and employers, move towards collective or collaborative solution-focused approach? Because you mean sometimes it's the other one are far from the right, the other one from the left. They can't move towards the center. What is it that needs to be done for them to reach a compromise, to say?
Yes, to move from the conflict approaches, where people take each other for enemies when they are supposed to be colleagues within the labor space, right? To move towards what we rather call a unitary system, where solutions are boiled from the same pot. Even when you are within the labor movement and you are from the government party, you all work within the same economy. You want all that is good for both the government and the employees. None of them seeks the economy to collapse, because if it collapses, there will be retrenchments. There will be, the implications of a collapsing economy will be felt by everyone. So, in my position, I thought maybe it was more better to move away from the conflict approaches to rather approach collective bargaining in a much more unitary approach.
All right, we've got 5 minutes to wrap up this conversation. What role should government policy, because we have to have these policies. Earlier on you mentioned that the approach also ought to be within the auspice of the law. That means that should be governed by what the law says. What role should government policy and regulation play in promoting fair and effective collective bargaining?
Yes, collective bargaining has to happen within the auspices of the law. The Public Service Bargaining Council has to be erected, it has to be institutionalized, it has to happen, right? So that the bargaining, the negotiations happen within it, not outside it. And if it happens within it, therefore it means that there is compliance with the law, right? Rather than a situation where now every union wants it done the way it wants it to be done. As compared to what the law wants it to be done, right? How the law wants it to be done. If when the Public Service Act of 2008 was enacted, one of the key things was to institutionalize collective bargaining, which had never been there within the public service. So if you erect that structure and then later sabotage it and deregister it, it means that then you are negating the gains of that particular legislation.
All right. Yes. We've got 3 minutes to wrap up this. Now, maybe if you have any examples locally or international that you can share where cooperatives and negotiations have led to sustainable benefits for both employer and employees. Because at the end of the day, you said if they come from this, if they don't, they come from enemy perspective, they're all going to feel the pinch. Where have we seen the approach coming from both sides, having benefited both the employee and the employer?
Yes, I will give a local example.
All right.
We currently have an act of parliament that has been passed recently, the Employment and Labour Relations Bill. That particular act was handled in a very, very unitary approach, so that it espouses the interests of all the parties, right? The employers, government, and the labor movement. Parliament just passed it. So it's not a matter of where it happens. It's a matter of, how the parties themselves want it to happen within a labor spectrum.
All right, we're wrapping up now. How can Botswana's labor sector modernize to align with global best practices in collective bargaining?
Well, we have the institutions, we have the laws, we have, all we need to do is to comply with the laws. Yes, we have the laws that espouse best practices, as I just mentioned, the Employment and Labour Relations, the Public Service Act of 2008. If we were to align our practices with what it entails, get back the bargaining council so that it houses the negotiations, then everything will fall in place.
All right, and that's how we come to the end of this conversation already, Professor. Thank you so much for such expertise. I understand now that those who are within the labor movements are understanding what is the responsibility of those labor movements. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And that's how we come to the end of this conversation. I'm coming right back with the 3 o'clock bulletin.
Financial literacy has a significant protective role, particularly in preventing